Watch the mercury rise as the pressure of the narrative builds toward an explosive and unforgettable conclusion. This is high-stakes drama at its finest, where every second counts and every word matters. Hit subscribe now and witness the breaking point of the truth as it unfolds.
My sister forged my name on a deed transfer and sold the house I owned, then disappeared with her husband and my entire savings. I found out standing in my own kitchen when a stranger knocked on the door and told me I had 30 days to vacate his property. I thought I was going to collapse right there on the tile floor. Then my 14-year-old nephew looked up from his laptop and said, "Aunt Miranda, I already know, and I already handled it." 72 hours later, my sister called me from a holding room at Heathrow Airport, screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Have you ever been so thoroughly erased by someone you loved that you started questioning whether you ever existed at all? Or maybe you have spent years being the one who holds everything together, while everyone else takes credit for the structure you built? Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from, and what time it is there right now. I want to know who is out here with me. My name is Miranda. I am 31 years old, and for the past 6 years I have been a licensed real estate attorney in Portland, Oregon. I know contracts, I know deed law, I know exactly what fraud looks like on paper, which makes what happened to me both more humiliating and, eventually, more satisfying than I could have imagined. I need to back up. When our mother passed away 3 years ago, she left behind one asset, a paid-off craftsman house in southeast Portland that she had owned since the 80s. It was not a mansion. It was a small, warm house with creaky floors and a rose garden she had tended for 20 years. In her will, she left it to me. Not to split, not to share. To me because I had been the one who moved back during her illness, handled her medical paperwork, paid the hospital bills, and sat with her through the nights when breathing became difficult. My sister, Tamsin, had been living in London with her husband for 4 years by then. She flew in for the funeral and flew out 3 days later. I did not resent her for the inheritance. I understood that our mother knew who had shown up. What I did not understand was that Tamsin had been quietly building a different story in her head for 3 years. A story in which she had been wronged. A story in which I was the villain who had manipulated a dying woman. I know this because she told me, eventually, in the most dramatic and legally catastrophic way possible. 6 months ago, I accepted a fellowship firm in Seattle. A 12-month contract significant enough that I rented a furnished apartment there and came home to Portland on weekends. The craftsman house was mine. I had updated the utilities in my name, and I had been renting the lower unit to a quiet graduate student named Theo, who had lived there for 2 years without missing a single payment. During this stretch, I made one mistake. I had given Tamsin a key years earlier, back when she was visiting. Occasionally. And I thought it made things easier. I had never thought to change the locks after the inheritance because I had never believed she would do anything more than use the extra bedroom when she visited. She used a great deal more than that. What she and her husband had done, I would piece together later, was this. They had flown in quietly in October during a week. I was deep in a deposition in Seattle. Her husband, a man I will call my brother-in-law because, even now, I cannot bring myself to say his name without my jaw tightening, had done a title search months earlier. He had identified that a quitclaim deed, signed by me and notarized, could transfer the property in Oregon without a real estate agent if filed correctly. He had found a notary in Vancouver, Washington, one county over, who had apparently verified a signature that was not mine on a document I had never seen. They recorded the deed, they listed the house, they accepted a cash offer within 10 days, and they wired the proceeds, slightly over $400,000, to an account in the Cayman Islands that had been opened 6 weeks prior. I found out standing in my own kitchen on a Tuesday morning in November, holding a mug of coffee I never got to drink, when a man named Garrett knocked on my door and introduced himself as the new owner. He had a folder. He was apologetic. He had no idea anything was wrong. I set the mug down very carefully on the counter. I thanked him. I told him there had been an administrative error, and I would be in touch within 24 hours. I closed the door. Then I stood in the middle of that kitchen, in the house my mother had left me, and I felt the floor shift under my feet like the whole structure had become suddenly unreliable. My phone buzzed. A message from Tamsin. A photo of her and her husband at what looked like a hotel bar, somewhere warm, palm trees visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. The caption read, "Mom always said to invest in your future. We finally took her advice. No hard feelings, little sister. Yours and the smart one. You'll land on your feet." I did not cry. I am not sure I even blinked. I had spent 6 years reading contracts designed to obscure theft and call it business. I knew exactly what had been done to me, and I knew exactly how much documentation I would need. I went upstairs to tell my nephew. He had been staying with me for the month. His name is not important here. But he is 14. He has his father's analytical stillness, and he had been spending his school break doing things, on his laptop, that I did not always fully understand. He was interested in network security, the way some kids are interested in soccer, obsessively, quietly, with a vocabulary that made adults tilt their heads. When I walked into the room and told him what had happened, he did not say anything dramatic. He turned in his chair and looked at me for a moment. Then he said very calmly, "I know, and I already handled it." I stared at him. "What do you mean you handled it?" He turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was a timeline. Not a chart anyone had given him, one he had built. He explained it to me in the particular way teenagers explain things when they know more than you, and are trying not to make you feel bad about it. 3 weeks earlier, he had been using my laptop to download a course module when he noticed a browser alert he had not expected. Someone had queried the property records portal for the Craftsman address from a device that was logged into my home network. He had checked the MAC address. It was not my laptop and it was not his. Someone had been on my network remotely. He had set a flag. He had begun watching. When the notarized deed was recorded with the county, it triggered a monitoring alert he had quietly configured on my property records after reading about deed fraud during what he described as a slow weekend. He had not told me, because he did not want to alarm me until he was certain. Once he was certain, he had done 3 things. First, he had documented the fraudulent network access in a timestamped log file, including the IP trail that pointed back to a hotel in Portland, where Tamsin and her husband had stayed the week the deed was filed. Second, he had contacted the county recorder's office, using what he told me was a professional email voice, and flagged the deed as potentially fraudulent, which had triggered a hold on the funds from the sale that the buyer's escrow company had not yet fully released. The transfer to the Cayman account had been queued but not finalized. A 24-hour compliance review that he had prompted, with his flag, had paused the wire. Third, he had drafted a referral to the Oregon State Bar's ethics hotline regarding the notary in Vancouver. Attaching the network log, the IP records, and a side-by-side signature analysis he had created using a document comparison tool he found open source online. The notary's license had been flagged for review. He looked at me when he was done explaining and said, "The money hasn't moved yet. But they don't know that." I sat down on the edge of his bed. I looked at this 14-year-old boy who had apparently spent 3 weeks, quietly, building a case, while I drove back and forth between Portland and Seattle, thinking everything was fine. "You did all of this without telling me," I said. "I didn't want you to worry," he said, "until there was something good to tell you." I called my firm's managing partner that evening, Ife. I told her what had happened. She had a title fraud attorney on the phone within the hour. We filed an emergency motion to void the fraudulent deed before end of business the next day, because the escrow wire had been paused, and because the buyer had been acting in good faith, and was cooperative. Once he understood the situation, the transaction was unwound. Garrett was refunded from the escrow account. The house remained mine. Tamsin and her husband did not know any of this. They were somewhere warm, believing $400,000 was about to arrive in an account they controlled. The next morning, my nephew sat in the passenger seat as I drove him to get breakfast. He was quiet for a while, watching the Portland neighborhoods slide past the window. "She is going to try to spend it soon," he said. "She is confident. She thinks it worked." "How do you know?" He showed me his phone. A travel itinerary Tamsin had forwarded to a shared family email chain weeks ago, before any of this happened, for a trip to London that was scheduled for this week. She had booked business class. She had mentioned they were planning to look at flats in Kensington. "She is going to try to move the funds once she lands," he said. "And the hold is still on the account." I looked at him. "So what happens when she tries?" He adjusted his glasses and looked out the window. "She finds out the numbers on her screen were a preview, not a confirmation." What he had done, I learned over breakfast, was slightly more than flag a county record. He had also inserted a notification hook into the escrow portal, using a vulnerability he had reported to the company's security team afterward, and which they had since patched. When Tamsin's husband logged into the offshore portal and attempted to initiate the transfer, the system showed a successful confirmation. The balance appeared. The numbers were there. But the hook had routed the confirmation through a sandboxed mirror that reflected back what they wanted to see without executing on the real network. "They think the money is sitting there," he said, eating his eggs. "It is not. It is still in the escrow hold, but they are going to fly to London feeling very good about themselves. And when they try to access it from there, through a foreign network, that is when the real bank's compliance system is going to have questions." "Questions like what?" "Like why someone in the UK is attempting to access a Cayman account, tied to a flagged wire transfer, linked to a deed fraud investigation in Oregon." I put down my fork. "You said a tripwire." He shrugged the way teenagers shrug when they are trying not to look pleased with themselves. They boarded their flight that evening. The next night I was in the living room of my house, the one that was still mine, when my phone rang. Tamsin. Video call. She never video called. I picked up. She was standing in what looked like a bank branch or a financial services office in London. Her husband was behind her. Both of them had the particular rigid expression of people who had been confident an hour ago, and were not confident anymore. "Miranda," she said, "there is a problem with the transfer." I kept my face neutral. "What kind of problem?" "The account is frozen. They are saying there is a fraud flag on the originating wire. They are asking for documentation that we are not able to provide." Her voice had a brittle edge to it. "I need you to call your bank and sort this out." "My bank," I said. "The escrow company, whoever is holding the funds. Tell them there was no fraud. Tell them this was a legitimate sale." I looked at her for a long moment. She had the same eyes as our mother. I used to find that comforting. "Tams," I said, "there was no legitimate sale. You forged my signature. You recorded a fraudulent deed. The transaction has been voided and the house is still mine. The funds you are trying to access do not exist in the account you think they exist in, and everything your husband did on my network 3 weeks ago has been documented and submitted to the district attorney's office." The silence on the other end was the kind that has physical weight. "You are lying," she said. But she did not sound like she believed it. "I am an attorney," I said. "I do not lie about legal exposure. I document it." Behind her, I could see her husband say something to her in a low voice. She shook her head at him. "Miranda, this is not. You do not understand. We needed this. We have debts. We have been drowning for 2 years. You got everything. Mom gave you everything, and you did not even need it. You already have a career. You have your apartment. You have—" "I have the house that Mom left me," I said, "and I still have it." She started crying. It was not the kind of crying that moved me. I had seen her cry strategically enough times growing up to recognize the difference. "If you press charges," she said, "I will never forgive you. You committed deed fraud, wire fraud, identity fraud, and notary fraud across 2 states and an international border." I said, "Forgiveness is not the variable I am currently optimizing for." I ended the call. 2 hours later, her husband tried to use the credit card they had opened in my name, the one I had not yet discovered, at a hotel in Kensington. The card had been flagged by my credit monitoring service, which my nephew had quietly enrolled me in 6 weeks earlier when he first noticed the network anomaly. The transaction was declined. The hotel called the fraud line. British financial authorities were notified of the attempted use of a card linked to an active American fraud investigation. They were detained at the hotel the following morning. A week later, I drove to the airport to pick up my nephew, who was heading back to his parents. He had his backpack over one shoulder and his laptop bag over the other, and he looked exactly like what he was, a 14-year-old kid who had spent his school break building something important. I asked him, in the car, how he had known to start watching in the first place. He was quiet for a moment. "She called me once a few months ago," he said. "She was asking about you, about your schedule, where you were staying, whether you came home on weekends. She said she was planning a surprise visit." He paused. I didn't think she meant a good surprise. I looked at the road. "You could have told me," I said. "I know," he said. "But I wanted to be sure first. Adults stop thinking clearly when they're scared. I needed you to be able to think clearly." He was 14 years old and he was not wrong. The district attorney's office in Multnomah County filed charges 3 weeks after the detention in London. Deed fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, forgery. The extradition process moved slowly, the way legal processes always do, but it moved. 6 months after that knock on my door, my sister and her husband were arraigned in a Portland courtroom. They had hired separate attorneys, which told me everything I needed to know about the stability of their partnership, once things became genuinely difficult. The notary in Vancouver surrendered her license in a consent agreement with the state board. It turned out mine was not the first signature she had verified without actually verifying it. That investigation opened 4 additional cases. The buyer, Garrett, was gracious throughout. He had done nothing wrong. When the transaction was unwound and his funds returned, he sent me a letter. He said he hoped I got to keep the rose garden. I wrote back and told him my mother would have appreciated that. My father, who had been living in Arizona and staying carefully neutral about everything involving Tamsin for as long as I could remember, called me after he heard what had happened. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long to see it clearly. He asked if he could visit. I said yes. He stayed for 2 weeks, and he fixed the garden gate that had been sticking for 3 years. And he sat on the porch every morning, and I remembered, for the first time in a long time, what it felt like to have a parent in my corner. I did not reach out to Tamsin. I did not answer when she called from the holding facility. I did not respond to the letter her attorney sent suggesting we discuss a restitution agreement that would allow her to avoid a custodial sentence. Her attorney was welcome to discuss whatever he liked with my attorney. I was not interested in the conversation myself. There is a version of this story where I feel guilty, where I sit with the weight of what it means to watch your sister be handcuffed in a foreign country, where I second-guess the call, the documentation, the decision not to warn her before the trap closed. I do not live in that version. What I live with is this. I am sitting on my mother's porch on a Friday evening in April, the rose gardens starting to come back from winter. My nephew's latest email open on my phone, in which he tells me he has been accepted to an early entry program in computer science at a university that recruits specifically for security research talent. My father is inside making something that involves garlic and sounds promising. I raised a glass of wine to the garden, and I thought about my mother, who used to say that the people who love you do not keep score, because they are not competing. They are just showing up. She was right. She was almost always right. I learned, later than I should have, that you cannot negotiate with people who see your success as something they are owed. You cannot soft-pedal boundaries to people who interpret kindness as access. You can only document everything, trust the people who show up without being asked, and let the legal system do the work it was designed to do. The house still has creaky floors. The rose garden needs another month before it is fully back. And the gate, thanks to my father, does not stick anymore. Some things, it turns out, are worth exactly what you paid for them.